And welcome into the Roundtable. I'm Bill Priestley. Today we're going to throw on our lawyer hats and talk about the law. And we're bringing us Matthew Leffler, our armchair attorney out of Chicago, as well as Lauren Beacon, our maritime professor out of Boston. Both of you, thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about AB5 here and also the protests going on in Oakland, and then also a little bit about the enforcement of what's going on in this practice as well. Just to recap, details probably everybody knows here. Obviously, AB5 becomes law. Protests are launched in Oakland. Lawsuits are launched. And then there was also a motion by the state to kind of quell the protests. And then the judge yesterday said that they needed more time to consider that particular motion. Lauren, let me start with you on this as maritime professor. As you look at airports are under tight security, obviously, because of their cargo and obviously what you can do with a plane. Ports, not so much. Are there any rules or regulations regarding the efficiency of the unloading of cargo that were obviously breached with these protests? Any laws around or any regulations around what was going on, regardless of hampering the flow of commerce?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really hard to say because they were, well, so obviously they were blocking, and there's reports that they were blocking some of those ports. And great to be here today. Thank you very much for having me. It's really hard to say if they were actually breaking those laws as it relates to maritime commerce. So maritime commerce laws are all about the efficient movement of goods, moving off and on to the port. So obviously blocking a port entry point is going to be problematic. As that relates to maybe some of the ocean shipping laws, not really. However, it'd be hard pressed to say no. So why do people protest? They don't feel as though they're being heard. And so, that's the bigger problem here is that if we're having people who aren't feeling as though they're heard that are so crucial to the movement of those goods as part of the larger ocean global shipping, that's a problem.
Yeah. Matt, let's jump over to the biggest issue here that a lot of people are going to jump on, and that is going to be First Amendment, where you have people saying, well, that's the government, the city, basically saying you shouldn't do this protest as far as you look at that. Let's start big picture. What's the relationship between a person's right to express themselves and the government's, shall we say, responsibility in some ways to keep the peace?
I am so happy to be here. I'm a huge First Amendment advocate, of course, but what's important to note here is that there's always restrictions on time, place, and manner of how you speak. And so when you're talking about something like restricting the rights of an individual to speak, you can't do certain things. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and you can't block a public roadway. And this is the challenge we find with protesters. Whether you want to talk about an issue or not, stopping the flow of traffic is very dangerous and generally illegal. So the city was, in this case, was trying to get a temporary restraining order and ultimately an injunction. They didn't get the TRO, but what's going to end up happening is if you block a roadway, you're probably going to get arrested. It's just a very dangerous thing to do.
Is there, though? I mean, as far as, obviously there are places where you obviously can't do it, and you outline those well. But I mean, past that, are there any different relationships between how the state can react to a protester, or it's just someone basically shouting their views?
I mean, it's where you stand typically. I mean, it's a sidewalk. If you're on a sidewalk or you're off the roadway, you can do whatever you want to do. There are going to be reasonable restrictions. Maybe, hey, it's 2 a.m. and you're in a public residential area. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Those are those like time, place, and manner restrictions. But the big key here is if you're going to go protest and you're going to exercise your First Amendment right, and you should always exercise your First Amendment rights when you feel that you need to, there's going to be restrictions that'll happen. And if you try to do something that's going to be dangerous or block a roadway, just expect you're probably going to get arrested. Maybe not given a charge, maybe just taken home or taken to the clink for a little bit. But that is the reasonable restrictions we all have. That's organized society, and we wouldn't want to have it any other way.
Lauren, there was a lawsuit, obviously the lawsuit filed by the city to certain individuals. Obviously, you can't sue a large mob because that'd be like me saying, all right, everybody on Market Street, you're now being sued by me. You can't do that. But so they have to name certain individuals with this as well. With that, they get some sort of a time period where they get to respond, normally 30 days. That was pushed up to basically 4. You were told on Friday you would have to appear in court on Monday. And that's kind of what happened there. How does a person's ability to respond get cut to that short a time?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You do have to file the suit against somebody. And so what I saw here, it wasn't surprising to me. This there's a lot at stake here. There's a lot at stake for blocking access to a port. So by the time as I was reading, by the time the actual suit was brought, the protests had kind of quelled and kind of stopped. And, maybe they were moving over into their designated First Amendment right protest locations. So the problem of whether or not the port was being blocked had kind of been almost mooted. But at that point, if you're blocking a port, that's a huge deal. That is a huge deal. And if they weren't actually blocking the port, but they were impeding the business or the flow of the goods, that's a huge deal. And so what I see is the judge saying, I recognize this is a huge deal and we need to move this up. This is something that needs to happen immediately. The larger picture here is we're seeing a lot of the labor side of the very important key pieces of the supply chain. We're seeing maritime, we're seeing truckers now, we're seeing rail having trouble and having concerns and feeling mistreated. And so what we're seeing is some unrest there, and logistics supply chain generally doesn't like chaos. And so I almost commend the judge for moving it up, because that shows that he wants to get this he or she wants to get this moving right away. But on the other hand, it doesn't give a lot of time to the respondents here, to the individual truck drivers being named. They could probably file something to push it off, to maybe delay it. Certainly if they feel as though they can't prepare for Monday. But the judge, to me, in this case, is signaling this is a big deal. We have to address it right away.
Gotcha. Matt, let's jump to the enforcement part of this. And in terms of doing that, there's something called the Private Attorney General Act of 2004 law that empowers employees to sue employers as sort of a substitute for action by the Attorney General or a regulator. Obviously, we're talking about enforcement from an employee perspective as opposed to a bottom-up as opposed to a top-down oversight. How do you see this implementing as part of AB5's enforcement?
Did you feel that shiver down your spine, Bill? PAGA is something that every single person that does business in California understands what the Private Attorney General Act does. PAGA. A PAGA claim is when essentially the government outsources the enforcement of certain wage and hour claims to private litigants to go after those companies. And what ends up happening with AB5, and I want to make sure it's very clear, AB5 isn't new, folks. This is a codification of a Supreme Court decision in California called Dynamex back in 2018. It's not like this law is new to really anybody who's doing business in California. But what PAGA does is it allows an individual litigant to represent the interests of other people that are similarly situated. That sounds like a class action, doesn't it, Matt? Yes, it does, but it's not. It's class action light. 75% of what you recover in a PAGA claim goes to the state of California, but it has fee-shifting provisions. So what will end up likely happening with AB5, just as it happened with this stuff before it was codified, is claims that are going to be individualized, but then incorporated with other people. And the thing that everyone understands that does business in California now is you can't buy insurance to cover you in PAGA claims. It's not liability insurance you typically think of in a nuclear verdict or some other catastrophic accident. These are out-of-pocket expenses that can go from being a couple $100,000 in liability or potential liability to millions of dollars of liability with uninsured losses. Now, this is what makes people so hesitant to think, well, is this the future we see for all the country? And many states are looking at versions of PAGA as ways to generate new revenue for the state, but also enforce these labor laws. We talk about the 70,000 potential truck drivers who are potentially misclassified. In California, generally, they believe over 1 million people are misclassified as independent contractors versus employees. This will be very, very interesting over the next few months.
Lauren, let's jump to that national issue, as you mentioned, of course, with unrest among labor at different mediums in terms of freight. How much of what happens here in California is going to be used as a cautionary tale or a blueprint for governments and or labor at perhaps other areas in the country? The Port of Houston has seen some protests in recent weeks. How do you see this affecting other laws and other possible actions by protesters in terms of going up against what they believe is an unfair law?
Well, I mean, like Matt said earlier, it's important to exercise your First Amendment right. If you feel as though you're not being heard, find a way to be heard. I caution against impeding the movement of goods. Right now we're in a I mean, really, we're in some trouble overall as a country trying to get these goods in and out of our ports. And so by impeding the movement, you're going to get attention, but you're also going to be harming pretty much everybody across the country. What's being kind of observed here is how this happens. So and what's going to happen from this. So is this going to be the new method for independent contractors versus employees? Currently, even without AB5 being fully in effect, I'm reading that there are some companies that are saying, look, move out of the state here, or get on board and become an employee, almost kind of a proactive way, because at this point, AB5 is moving forward. They're really looking for Governor Gavin Newsom to exempt them, and there are some other exemptions that have been provided. They're having exemptions from there's hairstylists, there's attorneys, of course, exempted from it. Doctors are exempted from it, and so they're looking for this exemption. And as a group, it seems like to me across the board, I mean, you're having trucker associations come out and say they're against AB5. If the entire industry doesn't want to be protected from this unfair independent contractor versus employee designation that is really the crux of what Dynamex was getting at, then why not start to have those conversations and listen to them and maybe provide those exemptions? I think that this has larger ramifications for the entire country, and we're going to see, is this going to be, I mean, we can't have California doing it so significantly different than the other states out there. And as we've talked about before, California provides most of the import-export movement of the goods that we use as U.S. consumers.
Yeah, we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. That's, this is something that is going to be on the minds of a lot of different people as we go forth in terms of looking at how other teams, how other people, how labor is going to respond, how governments are going to respond, state governments across the country. Thank you both for joining us. It's been an inspiring discussion, and we can only hope and wait and watch.
Thank you for having us. Just one last thing.
Sure.
The ABC test is common in over 20 states today. So
Yes.
just keep in mind, this is not that new. This is a pretty typical way of classifying workers and independent contractors.
Know what you're doing, that's for sure. Thanks for joining us, both of you. We'll take a short break, and we'll come back after this with the rest of our show.